After mistakenly drugging my archenemy Richard, we were locked in a room together. Trembling with fear and begging for mercy, he lightly bit my chin and whispered hoarsely, "Isn't this all your fault for being so reckless? Now, endure the consequences, no matter how exhausted you are." The next day, as we were about to run away, I still teased him about his weakness and lack of strength. However, 3 days later, he unexpectedly became the stepbrother in my reformed family and moved into my house. That night, my father stood at my bedroom door, advising me not to offend this man in power. Separated by a wall, I was held in Richard's arms on his lap. He used his tie to cover my mouth and sneered, "Sister, if you dare say I'm weak, don't cry tonight if you have the guts." Richard leaned back on the sofa, his dark eyes fixed on me. The atmosphere was both dangerous and ambiguous. I pressed myself against the door, trying to turn the doorknob while shivering and explaining, "Richard, it wasn't me." He remained indifferent, with a calm expression that clearly showed disbelief. The hotel room door was locked from the outside. As I struggled with the locked door, Richard threw off his tie and approached me. At that moment, I wished I could melt into the wall and disappear. Luckily, Richard just passed by me and entered the bathroom. I immediately called Kathy on my phone, distraught, and asked, "Why did you give Richard that?" "Lily, haven't you been fed up with him constantly opposing you for so long? Isn't this helping you vent your frustration?" I closed my eyes. Walking to the coffee table, pouring myself a glass of water, I drank it all in one gulp, trying to suppress my anger. "But you locked me and him in a room together," I said after a few silent seconds. "I'll immediately have someone come and unlock the door." Hanging up the phone, I inexplicably felt a dryness in my mouth and drank another glass of water. When Richard came out of the bathroom, I was just planning to drink a third glass. "Lily," he looked at me expressionlessly. "What are you drinking?" My thoughts began to slow down involuntarily. Looking at him, I replied slowly. Richard walked over to me without a word, trapping me between him and the sofa. He scrutinized me from above. "Are you doing this on purpose?" he asked slowly. "Do you want me?" Wide-eyed, I stood up and pushed him away. "Richard, what are you thinking? Don't you know how much I dislike you?" I blushed and pressed him onto the sofa, straddling his lap. My gaze traced his features, and wherever my eyes landed, my hand followed. "Where do you get your confidence from?" I said seriously. "Didn't you realize? You are actually very unattractive." I analyzed with a straight face. "Don't you think your nose is too sharp and your eyes?" My voice grew softer and quieter until I couldn't speak anymore. Richard's face was too close, dangerously close to mine, so close that I could almost kiss him. Richard lightly touched my face and gazed at me, asking, "Why do you hate me so much?" I moved away slightly. Hesitantly, I whispered, "Because you like Winnie. Winnie's father and my father worked at the same company, with her father holding a higher position as a director than mine. Winnie had always looked down on me because of this, making her my most hated person. Seemingly not understanding, Richard furrowed his brows and asked, "Who do I like?" The temperature in the room unknowingly rose, making me feel flustered. I held my ground and accused him with reason. "In my freshman year, I saw your car picking her up at the school gate." Growing angrier as I recalled, I slapped him abruptly across the face. Winnie said it was her suitor picking her up. Richard took my hand off his face, explaining casually. He said the car had been borrowed by a friend before leaving the country and he had never liked Winnie. I nodded slowly, looking understanding. "You are ugly, and her not liking you is normal." Richard smiled enigmatically but said nothing in response. He seemed disbelieving, so I earnestly told him, "For example, your eyes." I stared at his trembling eyelashes and whispered, "Don't move." As if guided by a higher power, I kissed his eyelid. In that moment, the underlying restlessness in my heart found a moment of solace. With a soft voice, I negotiated with him, "If I kiss you, will you stop moving, okay?" Richard swallowed hard, his gaze darkening. Seeing this, I lowered my head and kissed his throat gently. Richard closed his eyes, leaning back on the sofa with a muffled hum. "Lily," I heard him say hoarsely. I didn't study his throat any longer and looked up to him. His voice was hoarse. "Who taught you to be so seductive?" I felt dizzy and couldn't quite understand his words. As he sat up, he took my hand and placed it on his disheveled shirt collar. "Playing with the buttons on my shirt, kissing wherever it moves, right?" he hinted. I touched my blushing ear and nodded. Richard nudged my nose with his, which I had mocked earlier. Lips moving? He whispered. I leaned closer, making a gentle contact. My voice was as soft as melting gummy bears, with a hint of sweetness. Another kiss was imminent. With every soft word Richard spoke, I kissed him like a chick pecking at grains. It continued until Richard answered a phone call. Richard, I'm downstairs at the hotel. I'll bring someone to unlock the door and deliver the antidote to you. Hearing the word unlock, I felt a bit resistant. Gazing at Richard with misty eyes, I asked, can't we kiss anymore? He muted the call and casually caressed my chin. Are you responsible for the kiss? He whispered darkly. I nodded firmly. Yes, I am responsible. Richard turned off the mute and instructed, no need to come up. Why, Richard? He lifted me up and said in a voice that was almost hoarse, there is the antidote now. Then he hung up. Richard said he only drank half a glass. I couldn't understand why. An hour later, after drinking 2 glasses myself, the effects of the drug had worn off, but he seemed completely unaffected. Whether I played dead or begged for mercy, Richard ignored them all, even finding time to mock me. It's all your fault for being so reckless. Now, endure the consequences, no matter how exhausted you are. Even when I explained that it wasn't me, he didn't believe me. The next day, against all odds, perhaps due to an overdose, I woke up groggy. I only remembered drinking 2 glasses of water and feeling drowsy, then being carried into the bedroom by Richard. Turning my head, I looked at Richard, who was still asleep, holding me in his arms. I immediately realized that this jerk must have been fooling me, using me as a tool to test the antidote. Just then, Richard woke up suddenly. Our eyes met, and he hugged me tightly, resting his chin on the side of my neck. He spoke with a hint of tiredness. I'm sorry. Last night, I could already guess that it's just an accident. If it's okay, I interrupted him nonchalantly. Sitting up, I said calmly, I didn't take it seriously. Richard did. He paused for a second, then stared at me expressionlessly. Coolly, he questioned, what do you mean? Remembering his pursuit of Winnie, I felt a sudden inexplicable sense of loss creeping up. Exhaling softly, trying to maintain my composure, I picked up my clothes and said calmly, it means that when we walk out of this room, I hope we both forget what happened last night. I really don't want to have any relationship with you. Richard sat up, and for a moment, he gazed at me without blinking, with the blanket draped around his waist. Lily. Are you playing with me? Focused on dressing, I didn't pay much attention to what he was saying. However, before leaving, I couldn't resist teasing him one last time. Richard, weak and powerless, remember to tell your future girlfriend to watch her mouth and not mention this incident to avoid embarrassment and becoming the laughingstock of the circle. I seized the perfect timing. As soon as the words left my mouth, I slammed the door shut without giving him a chance to respond or retaliate. At the hotel entrance, I bumped into Winnie and her group of friends. Oh, isn't this Lily? You're not very decent, coming out of a hotel so early. Initially feeling a bit guilty and considering sneaking away, her harsh words made me smile. So, I raised my voice on purpose and asked her, what did you say, Winnie? Are people staying at this hotel indecent? Instantly, all eyes in the hotel lobby turned to us, needles of scrutiny piercing into Winnie. Fuming, she pushed me abruptly. Lily, are you crazy? I staggered backwards a few steps until I hit the glass door to the side of the hotel, twisting my ankle in the process. I let out a painful sigh as Winnie's attention was diverted by the footsteps behind me. Her friends expressed their astonishment. Winnie, do you know this handsome guy? Looks like he's coming straight for you. Nonchalantly, Winnie shrugged with a princess-like demeanor. He's been chasing me for a while, and I've been considering whether to accept him. The footsteps drew closer. Enduring the pain in my foot, I leaned on the door and hurriedly left, not daring to look back. Yet the conversation I overheard continued to echo in my ears. I have a question, I hope you don't mind. You don't seem to be dressed neatly either, you're on par with that woman we just confronted. Richard's voice was too low, I couldn't hear clearly. Then came the voice of that woman again. No wonder, working all night. Not having time to take care of yourself is normal. It's normal. I blinked my dry eyes, forced out a faint smile. I was glad I had just made it clear to Richard to keep our distance. It was obvious. He didn't want to have any relationship with me at all. After that day, Richard called me. Subconsciously, I avoided it, immediately hung up and blocked him. Just in case, I even changed my phone number immediately. But 3 days later, I inevitably saw him. Still, at my house. Dad's new girlfriend, who is Richard's mother, moved in to live with us. And Richard came along with her. Aunt gently patted my hand and introduced Richard to me. Lily, I didn't mention it to you before, this is my son Richard, you can call him brother. Brother, he just returned to the country not long ago, the house is not yet renovated. Lily, can you accommodate him here for a while? I wanted to say, with him being so wealthy, can't he rent a place? But facing Aunt's gentle request, the refusal was stuck in my throat. It turned into, Aunt, no problem. I lowered my head, didn't dare to look at Richard. The tone sounded very stiff. Brother, no need to be polite to me. Richard sneered inexplicably. And did not say anything else. All day Richard acted normal. It seemed like he had already forgotten what happened 3 days ago. Until dinner time, Dad suddenly asked me, Lily, do you have time tomorrow? I have a friend's son who is the same age as you, also in his junior year of college. He saw your picture and wants to meet you. What do you think? The blunt elder created a blind date mode. I poked at the rice in my bowl in a daze, tangled about how to answer. Richard suddenly spoke up. She doesn't have time. Then he casually explained to the two elders, my sister asked me to help her revise her paper tonight. He slowly lifted his eyes, his gaze falling directly on my face. Probably going to take all night. Dad didn't think much. Nodded, okay, we'll arrange to meet another time. I was shocked. My chopsticks even fell on the table. Dad looked at me and asked, Lily, what's wrong? Richard looked calm and composed. Under the increasingly suspicious gazes of Dad and Aunt, I nodded and replied word by word, brother, you're right. I waited until 11 p.m. that night. Richard hadn't come. I couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief, grabbed my nightgown and went to the bathroom. When I came out of the bathroom after drying my hair, the door was knocked. It was the last person I wanted to see. I opened the door a crack, politely smiled at Richard. Brother, it's too late tonight. The paper can be revised tomorrow. He chuckled lightly, not intentionally lowering his voice. Lily, don't pretend with me. Either let me in, or we settle our accounts right here. I don't mind letting both of them know that you took advantage of me. I suddenly looked up, staring incredulously at this man who was turning the tables. Dad's room was also on the second floor, not far away. I heard the sound of him turning the doorknob in his room. Without hesitation, I opened the door a bit and pulled Richard in. The next second, I heard Dad's familiar footsteps. Richard had a faint anger in his eyes. He lifted me and sat me on the desk, leaning down to kiss me. A very aggressive kiss, leaving me no room to escape. Dad stopped at my door. Lily, are you asleep? I had to bite Richard to make him let go of me. What's wrong, Dad? I tried to calm my rapid breathing, my mind was tense to the extreme. But Richard had already loosened his necktie, wrapping it around my hands one by one. His posture was relaxed. The kiss slid from my forehead to my nose. But the intruding man completely ignored if there was anyone outside. His deep and hoarse voice asked, Lily, what does virginity mean? If you consider 2 hours as virginity, then today brother will double serve you. Dad's voice came from outside again. If you are not asleep, can I come in? I pressed Richard's hand, hurriedly shouted through the door a few times, wait, Dad. I raised my hand to push Richard's chest away. Can you let me speak first? Richard finally lifted his head from my neck, his face mocking as he raised his lips. Did you give me a chance to speak that day? There was a hidden fire in his eyes, seemingly ready to ignite me immediately. Dad was still waiting at the door. I had no choice but to compromise. I looked up and delicately touched his lips. Richard leaned in for another kiss, lightly nibbled on my tongue before letting go. I calmed my breathing, left the door slightly ajar. Only stuck my head out. Dad, do you need anything? Dad sighed, speaking with a heavy heart. Dad realized today that when you said you were going to edit your paper with Richard tonight, you were lying. Otherwise, why hasn't he come to see you yet? Just hearing Richard's name made me extremely sensitive. My heart tightened. Dad continued in an inquiring tone, Lily, do you not want to go on a blind date? Richard seemed to have run out of patience, and while I was talking to Dad, he had walked to the back of the door. He grasped my waist, lightly kissing my shoulder as I hid in the darkness behind the door. speaking very softly but with a clear message. Do you not want to go on a blind date, sister? I was so nervous that my thoughts were in chaos, I didn't dare to move at all. After all, Dad and Richard were separated by just a door. If he pushed the door a bit further, he could see the man kissing my shoulder. I swallowed hard, pretending to be calm. Just wanting to quickly end the conversation with Dad, I casually replied, I'm okay with it, Dad. The next moment, Richard bit my shoulder. I held back a groan. Dad seemed to not notice anything unusual, he just said, That's good. Dad will carefully choose a partner for you too. His footsteps gradually moved away, and finally, Dad went back to his room. As the door closed, Richard turned and pressed me against the door. Pressing my shoulders with both hands, the pressure was not light. He had a smile on his lips, but his aura became increasingly tense. You give away your first time to me, and then you want to go on a blind date with someone else? Am I someone you can take advantage of irresponsibly? His words had just ended when his phone rang. Richard answered the call. My thoughts were in chaos. Was this considered a confession indirectly? I lowered my head, nervously clutching the edge of my skirt. After finishing the call, Richard looked over with gentle eyes. Before he could speak, I blurted out without sorting out my thoughts, I will take responsibility for you. Richard seemed to be somewhat reassured by my proactive attitude. The coldness in his eyes softened slightly. He was about to say something when his phone rang again. He glanced at the screen, lightly pinched my earlobe, and softly instructed, I have an urgent meeting now, I'll come back to find you after it, okay? I nodded, my earlobe rubbed red under his fingertips. Richard lightly kissed my forehead, his gentle voice elevating the room's romantic atmosphere by a notch. Good girl. Until the next morning, Richard had not returned from the office. Dad saw me up so early, realizing I hadn't stayed up late. He still arranged for me to go on a blind date with his friend's son. I had planned to go to the restaurant and tell the other person about having a boyfriend, and then leave. But when I pushed open the compartment door, I found that there was not only my blind date in the compartment, there was Richard, who had an aura as dark and fierce as a ferocious demon. He was crossing his legs, tapping his knee absent-mindedly. He looked noble and idle. Meeting my gaze, he leisurely licked his lips. Sister, come meet your boyfriend. The young man across from him awkwardly scratched his head. We're not even boyfriend and girlfriend yet, this is our first meeting. Richard smiled, but didn't respond to his words. With stiff steps, I walked over, each step painful. Brother. Richard remained silent, the smile on his lips never fading. But I felt more and more that I was in trouble. I could only sit awkwardly next to Richard, listening to the young man introduce himself with a smile and then suddenly ask, Lily, may I ask, have you ever been in a relationship, or, let me rephrase it, are you still a virgin? I paused, looking up at him. The young man spoke boldly, but his expression showed no sign of apology. Richard, who had been silent all along, spoke for the first time. Looking at him, he asked back, have you kept yours? This man named Peter explained confidently, men and women are different, Richard. I have only one condition, that is, I hope my partner is clean enough. Richard rudely dropped his chopsticks, embarrassing Peter in front of everyone. He smirked and said, my sister also has one condition. She hopes to find a person, not a dog. Sorry you don't measure up, so please leave. The young man's face turned livid with anger, but he didn't dare provoke Richard and had to leave in frustration. I breathed a sigh of relief, giving Richard a thumbs up with a smile, praising him, you are really good at talking. The silence in the air was palpable. He didn't respond to my words, but stared at me with a more sinister look. Then, in a gentle tone, he pronounced, it's time for us to settle the score, darling. Richard took me to the nearest place under his name. Even before we entered the bedroom, he started loosening his watch and tie. Lily, do you remember what you said last night? Richard pressed on as he advanced towards me. I backed away as I obediently replied, I remember. He nodded, with indifference in his eyes. Are you that responsible? He questioned. As he unbuttoned his shirt, he pulled me close to him against the wall. The survival instinct peaked, and I trembled as I pleaded, I can explain. With an air of inevitability. Richard agreed, beginning to explore the structure of my clothing. He pressed me against the wall, lowering his head to bite open my cardigan buttons. You explain yours. I explain mine, he stated. However, in reality, I didn't even have the energy to say much. My body was not strong enough to withstand Richard's enduring patience. "Sister, where is your explanation?" he coldly asked, not allowing me to speak, and continued to press me for an answer. "Don't gasp. Speak," he urged. Feeling pressured, I bit his neck out of frustration. Richard remained calm and collected, caressing the back of my head. "What's wrong with you? Do you like biting people so much?" he inquired. Seeing he was about to speak, I quickly covered his mouth, not giving him the chance to talk. Finally satisfied, Richard stopped hurling insults. After a while, he slightly pulled back, his lips hovering near mine. In a low and gentle whisper, he urged, "Call me brother, Lily." I held onto his shoulders, my breath shaky. "Brother. Call me brother again." It wasn't until evening that Richard and I returned home. During dinner, I confessed to my father that I was in a relationship and wouldn't need matchmaking for the time being. Richard had originally planned to announce it openly without giving the elders time to adjust. I was concerned about my father's hypertension, so I half pleaded, half convinced Richard to agree to confess as a condition of the exchange. Richard sat across from me, lightly raising an eyebrow in response to my words, showing his approval. One day, unable to keep it to myself any longer, I secretly told Kathy about being with Richard. She was shocked after hearing it and immediately called me. "Are you crazy, Lily? Didn't you hate Winnie the most? How come you're picking up even the men she rejects?" she exclaimed. It dawned on me that Richard had pursued Winnie before, which I had forgotten due to lack of recent news about her. Trying to explain to Kathy, I said, "But he treats me so well now, and I can feel that he really likes me. Winnie should be a thing of the past." Kathy, being realistic, mockingly said, "You have no idea of the allure of the unattainable. To Richard, Winnie is the unattainable white moonlight. If you and Winnie were hanging off a cliff together, do you know what he would do?" I asked, "What would he do?" "If you asked him that question, he would probably give you a particularly dumb answer. He would save Winnie and then die with you," she explained. Dismissing it as overdramatic due to her excessive reading of novels, I kept that thought in mind. Unexpectedly, 2 days later, a situation where a choice had to be made between two options arose. While waiting for Richard outside his company in the mall, I saw Winnie and her entourage. They were looking at Richard's direction through the glass, having a conversation about him. Standing a bit far away, I couldn't see clearly through the glass. Suddenly, Winnie exclaimed, "How is that possible?" Her companion asked, "Winnie, are you sure?" To which she responded, "Of course it isn't him." Having heard before that Winnie didn't like one of her pursuers, I was taken aback by her rejection and slander towards Richard. Anger surged within me. I transformed into a passionate defender of love and, walking over, sternly retorted to Winnie, "He's not, and you're spreading false rumors, do you know that?" Winnie turned around, giving me a disdainful look. I stared directly at her and said with emphasis, "He's not him. You're spreading baseless lies, you know that?" Winnie's eyes widened in disbelief. "Damn it, Lily, are you insane? What is wrong with you?" I was about to retort when she began bringing up my father. "Does your family have a history of mental illness? I heard my father talking about it the other day. He said your dad can't even handle basic work properly at his age. Is his brain malfunctioning so soon?" Her companion eagerly asked, "Mental illness passed down? Is that true?" Winnie shrugged, saying, "Most probably." Well, her dad got my dad so riled up that he lashed out at him, cursing him. My hands clenched by my side. Without showing any emotion, I walked towards her. In my mind, I thought, if Winnie insulted me, I would retaliate. But when she insulted my father, what I wanted more was to beat her until she begged for forgiveness. However, reality was far too cruel. As I engaged in a scuffle with Winnie and her companion, I didn't gain the upper hand. Winnie's brother, Alan, who had been watching from a distance, finally stepped in to separate us. Unaware of his presence, Alan swiftly approached and forcibly pulled my hair, dragging me away, accusing me, "So not only do you have a history of mental illness, but you also have anger issues, right?" He pressed my head and pushed it against the nearby elevator doors. "You maniac!" The intense pain, followed by a sense of confusion, made me feel like a clock had suddenly struck inside my head. More and more people gathered around to watch. Someone couldn't stand it anymore and came to stop Alan, warning him, "Stop it, I've already called the police." Alan shrugged, "Report as you like." She was the one who started the fight. At the police station, as I completed the registration with a large bump on my forehead, Richard arrived. I looked at him, about to say something when I saw him glance at me coldly and then head towards Winnie's group. Tears welled up in my eyes, all the grievances rushed in and fell down my cheeks. Next moment, there was a commotion from that direction. I turned to see, stunned. Things escalated rapidly. Richard wrapped his tie around his hand and started throwing punch after punch at Alan. Winnie exclaimed, attempting to pull him back. Richard, "If you touch me, I'll fight back," he threatened. "You can try." Richard said. He lifted Alan's collar, pressing his head against the back of his head before the police pulled him away. Without much emotion, he asked, "Alan, did it happen like this?" Following that, Alan's head slammed harshly against the glass door, shattering it. Before the police could intervene, some officers, having heard that Alan had started the fight, subtly mocked him. Despite that, when Richard broke free from their hold, he walked up to me. It was the most disheveled I had ever seen Richard, with smudges of dirt on his cheekbones and chin, sweaty with a serious look in his eyes. He raised his hand to touch the bandaged wound on my forehead, but eventually let it drop. Staring at me with reddened eyes, his voice trembling, almost inaudible, Richard apologized. "I didn't take care of you properly." In that moment, a sudden realization struck me as I remembered forgotten fragments from that day. "Why did you dislike me?" "Because you liked Winnie." Richard sneered. "I haven't even heard that name from you until now. It was all just a misunderstanding." He had never liked Winnie. As for Kathy's two-choice question, I had also figured that out. In such a situation, it wouldn't even be conceivable. Because if it were Richard, he wouldn't let me be in such a dangerous position as being at a cliff's edge. Due to Richard's altercation, the situation became more complicated. After Alan was taken to the hospital, Winnie complained to the police, concocting a story where I had aggressively initiated confrontation. Fuming, I wrenched myself out of Richard's embrace, countering, "She was the one who insulted my boyfriend and my father first." Winnie's facial expressions contorted in shock. Seeing Richard's gaze turn towards her, she hastened to deny, "It wasn't me, Richard. I absolutely didn't insult you. Today, all I did was see someone in the mall who looked like you. I just mentioned it." Nothing else. The suspicious gazes of the crowd fell on me again. I moved my lips. After a while, I lowered my head and muttered vaguely, "She called my boyfriend a dog." I heard her mention Richard, and not long after she said dog I really saw a dog at that time. It was that dog with a face like a bicycle seat. Her little lackey nodded, looking timid. Yes, Winnie was giving me information about that dog at the time. It was a misunderstanding on my part. Finally, Winnie took the initiative to reconcile, and I was able to get out of the police station. I held Richard's hand and walked towards the police station exit, and I couldn't help but say, "Brother, let me tell you. I just felt sorry that you pursued her and got called a dog, and that's why we argued today." Seeing Richard's expression darkening, I quickly added, "You don't have to explain. I had a lapse of memory that day. I just remembered now. It was a misunderstanding, a misunderstanding." Richard played with my palm, speaking casually. "How did you respond at that time?" I was eager to show myself, raised my chin, and made a very majestic appearance. I immediately retorted her. "How could you possibly be a dog?" I unintentionally raised my voice a bit, and I heard a few subtle coughs behind me. I turned around. Winnie and a few police officers were avoiding eye contact, pretending as if nothing had happened. I awkwardly explained with my head down, "I clearly meant your physique." Richard nodded, indicating that other areas weren't quite up to par. I shook his hand, humming and skipping around, not realizing the implication. Little did I know he would remember that for a week. A week later, the wounds on my body and face had mostly healed. He began to prove himself to me. "Richard, I don't want to be sitting down." He rested his head on my neck, completely absorbed in what he was doing. In response to my complaint, he was very dismissive. "Your head is still not well. You shouldn't be shaking it." "You liar. He just loves doing this." I embraced him honestly. Shedding tears quietly. After meeting Richard, I realized that seemingly cold and aloof person was actually quite sentimental inside. His sense of humor was innumerable. Initially, I had decided to let Richard off when suddenly the phone on the bedside table rang. He never answered the phone at this hour. However, this time, he went against his usual behavior and picked it up while holding me. He answered the call directly. "Richard." I was shocked and whispered to him, He leaned over and kissed me on the cheek and issued a single word to the person on the other end. Speak. Then he hung up, tossed the phone aside, and said, Richard, it's Winnie. A few days ago, I overheard Lily say at the police station's entrance that you used to pursue me, right? I didn't notice before. If I unintentionally hurt you, I'm sorry. Richard pinched my chin and lifted me from his embrace. Gazing at me lightly, he said, You've caused trouble. I firmly covered his mouth, warning him to keep quiet. Winnie got lost in her own world, speaking to herself. I wanted to say, if you, and anything else, can you try it? Richard took my hand away, adopting a business-like tone. How can we resolve this? Winnie's words were becoming more and more erratic. Richard also held my waist, preventing me from reaching for the phone. I was forced into a dead end. Burying my face into his neck, I almost nervously said, Next time. Next time, I'll sit still, okay? As a reward, Richard kissing me gently. Picking up the phone, at this time, Winnie was all alone. Did she not think she would be disturbing someone's nightlife? He reprimanded her in the most polite yet degrading tone, all while doing the most despicable thing. Richard's retaliation against Winnie's family did not stop at that day in the police station. I heard that Alan was mysteriously beaten and sent to the emergency room, causing trouble for Winnie's father. Someone in the industry reported him for taking bribes. The board quickly found evidence, and he was swiftly sent to prison. When I came across this news, it was already the next morning. My father happened to call. He was ecstatic to share with me. That person has finally stepped down. I heard it was Richard's assistant who brought the evidence. That child Richard, don't be fooled by his years in the business world, he's still filled with a sense of justice. Lily, if you see your brother, make sure he has time to come home for dinner, Dad's cooking for him. I was about to answer when the man next to me, who was sleeping, woke up at some point. In a tired voice, without lowering it, he spoke. Waking up so early, he half opened his eyes and pulled me back into his arms. Let's sleep a little longer with brother. My motion of holding the phone was completely petrified. Besides silence, all I could hear on the other end of the phone was the howling wind. In the most intense sunlight, Richard and I stood at the door of the house. I felt as ice cold as a corpse. Before entering, I looked at him with a heart like ash. I felt like my father would kill both of us. He was probably not fully awake, as his state of mind seemed particularly confused. He smiled, starting to talk nonsense. It sounded romantic, dying on the same day as you. Pushing the door open, as expected, I saw director sitting on the sofa with a gloomy expression, as if a storm was approaching. He pointed at us. Before I could speak, the phone rang. My father picked it up. Whatever was said on the other end, he went from expressionless to shocked. And eventually stood up in amazement. Don't me take that person's place? There's no such person, I can fill in first. My father couldn't contain his smile, full of regret. How could he be so confused, sentenced to 5 years, and after coming out, how will he survive in the industry? He couldn't help but chuckle, pretending to cough to cover it up. After hanging up the phone, without giving him a chance to speak, I hurried over to hug his arm. Wow. Dad, you're amazing. Did you get a promotion? He didn't fall for my act at all, pulled his arm back. He resumed his serious expression, looking at Richard. Don't think by pulling him down and pushing me up, I won't blame you for anything. Do you think I'm selling my daughter? Richard's attitude remained humble. It was the board acknowledging Uncle's abilities enough to put him in this position. I was just going with the flow. My dad couldn't contain his smile any longer. Seeing this, I immediately cheered and started praising. Dad, you are truly impressive. You are the most amazing dad in the world. He scolded me with a blush. The focus shifted back to Richard. It happened to be interrupted again before I could speak. Auntie picked up a hydrating spray and greeted her face with it, giving my dad a sideways glance. The children are willing to be together, you know. Dad was like a cannon, only destroying himself and not others. They are siblings. Richard calmly explained, Unless I have a separate household registration on my own. It won't have an impact. Seeing my father's silence, Auntie slammed the spray on the table. Clearly annoyed. Smiling and frowning at the same time, she said, Look at you, acting so defensive. If you're really afraid of people talking nonsense after they get married, then let them get married and be together. As she spoke, she got up to get their marriage certificate. Dad frantically grabbed her, asking what she was saying. He didn't even want to look at the two of us, waving his hand in disgust. "Don't be a nuisance in front of me," Auntie gave me a wink. I took it as her indirect approval. Before leaving, I took advantage of her distraction and planted a kiss on my dad's shiny forehead. "I love you the most, Dad." A few days later, my father had Richard over for a drink at home. He didn't allow me or Auntie to join. It was a heart-to-heart conversation between the two of them. When Richard returned, he was already a bit unsteady from drinking. He held my face, leaned in as if to kiss me. But just before our lips touched, he paused and pulled away slightly. With a husky voice, he said, "The scent of alcohol isn't pleasant. I'll take a shower first." Richard had a lot to say when he was drunk. He carried the scent of freshly showered, pulled me onto the balcony's lounge chair, and kissed me. "I love you." He let go of me, whispering, "Your father says he loves you more than anyone in the world." I gently touched his lips that were stained with red, nodding in agreement. "Yes," Richard looked at me. "I love you too." His eyes seemed tinged with a hint of melancholy. "But you used to despise me at the beginning. I visited your school countless times, wanting to talk to you, but you ignored me. When you got injured, waiting for your senior to take you to the hospital, you didn't want me to carry you." I stared at him in amazement, slightly gaping. Richard recounted his grievances. "You slept with me and then didn't take responsibility. Despite my repeated confirmations, you had to take responsibility before I let you sleep. In the morning, I carefully wanted to apologize for not being too restrained last night. You wouldn't even listen to me before you left." I suspect he was close to tears. He moved his lips. "You left me alone at the hotel." "No, the more I hear, the more I feel like a scumbag." All right, I was wrong. I'll make it up to you." Richard lowered his eyes, hiding his emotions. "How about tonight on the balcony?" I subconsciously wanted to refuse, but Richard looked too pitiful. Clutching my skirt, I forced myself to say, "I'll write 2 words." An hour later, "Richard, were you pretending to be drunk, right?" His eyes regained clarity, and I said I was drunk? "You were lying to me all this time." I let out my frustration by biting his shoulder. Richard remained silent. It was the last moment I looked into his eyes that were gentler than the moonlight. He said, "None of what I said was a lie to you. I love you. It was a long time ago, when you disliked me the most." Secretly loving someone is bitter, but luckily, I waited and finally got you.